everyone to our final talk from the discussion series about reconstruction after Urbicide in Ukraine. And I would like to begin from the thing that I really hope that everyone is fine and safe and we very appreciate that you find the opportunity to join us today and also take part in such an important discussion. My name is Maryana Sirko. I represent National Art Museum of Ukraine, which is one of the partners of this project with the Center for Urban Studies. And today we will have our final talk from this talk cycle. It will touch such an important topic as political aspects of violence against the city, and we will talk a lot about not only the destruction and how it influences on our life and our reflections, how we could reconstruct with all these consequences, but also about the question of memorialization, that what we could see from our previous discussions, that also is one of the a very important and in some way controversial topics. So it's also must be very good. It also should inspire us to find different solutions which we could could make in our Ukraine context. And I invite Svitlana Shlipchenko to present our speakers and also add some welcome word to this presentation.
Thank you, Maryana. I'm Svitlana Shlipchenko, and I represent the Center for Urban Studies, one of the partner institutions who initiated this series of these talks. Today we will speak here about the patterns of political violence and about reconstructions, patterns of reconstruction of European cities. And this topic is especially, I think, pressing, especially in the light of what had happened yesterday to Ukraine, this massive airstrikes and all actually attack on our infrastructural objects. But I think it's also, as Maryana pointed it out, it's important to think about reconstruction as well. And I'm happy to introduce Martin Coward, who is a lead editor in the Review of International Studies and Politics, and who is a professor at the University of Manchester, and who will tell us about two patterns of urban destruction, urbicide and infrastructural violence. What is the difference and what are the similarities between them? And perhaps I will come up with a question to both speakers, not to take much time then. My question is about resilience. Can we plan for it? Can we plan for it in physical terms, in the physical structures, and in terms of people and communities, how it could happen and how we can plan for it? Perhaps afterwards you can answer it. So Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's nice to see you all. I hope you're all safe. I want to say thank you for, well, both to the organizers for inviting me to be here today, and also to participants in the series. I've really enjoyed I've really enjoyed listening to the various kind of conversations so far in this series. I think it's been incredibly interesting. I also want to note at the beginning that I'm not really an expert on Ukraine, and obviously it's hard to get hold of sort of detailed information given the situation on the ground. And so I'm going to stick mostly to kind of conceptual questions, but if I make any kind of errors, please do correct me, or if you've got kind of insights from the ground that shed light on those kind of conceptual observations, please do say. So as we've heard in other presentations, particularly kind of going back to Francesco and Konstantin, there's a long history of the relationship between war and the city. And I think historically the city's frequently been a target or a theater of war. And I actually think, the more kind of that we reflect on this kind of question, recent claims that the city is something to be avoided in war, either as a target or a terrain, are actually derived from a very kind of unrepresentative sample of kind of historical kind of cases. So there used to be a period in the sort of the late 90s, early 2000s when particularly military planners would kind of give the impression that the city was something they wanted to proscribe, to avoid, that it was complex, that it was dangerous, but that it was also something that they thought should be ethically set aside as kind of sort of protected terrain. But I actually think that that's a kind of quite recent development in that more frequently the city has been a target, either as a kind of goal or as a symbolic target, or indeed as a kind of theater of operations. And I think that there are distinctive patterns to this. So, for example, we might see things like siege warfare and so on. I'll come on to this in a minute. There's kind of distinctive patterns. But what I want to get to later in the talk is that in the kind of post-Cold War period, the two distinctive patterns that seem to have emerged the most are urbicide, the destruction of the sort of everyday material fabric of the city, and the targeting of critical infrastructure. And I want to distinguish between those two things because I think slightly different things are going on in each, although they both are what we might call sort of anti-urban military violence or anti-urban violence in general. So I think if we look at kind of anti-urban warfare, or if we look at the kind of relationship between the city and war, we see a number of ways in which anti-urban kind of war fighting has emerged at sort of different historical periods. I also don't want to give the impression that these are sort of discrete things. They can mix and coexist and so on and so forth. But certainly across history, we've seen kind of anti-urban doctrines like siege warfare, for example, strategic bombing. And here I think about kind of Kenneth Hewitt's really interesting writing about sort of the strategic bombing of Europe and the way in which this should be seen as specifically anti-urban. Rubblization, which we've discussed previously in other kind of talks in this series, which seems to be a distinctively Russian tactic evolving from Afghanistan, but also in, for example, with Western militaries, European, North American militaries, the idea of sort of military operations in urban terrain, the so-called three-block war, or fighting in built-up areas, as it's sometimes called. And we can see these as actually kind of emerging sort of doctrines that are anti-urban in nature. And I think it's important to point that out. They take the city both as a theater and as a target, and they work to focus violence on and in the city as a kind of specific focus. But I want to say something that I think that there's a kind of wider sort of, if you like, sort of cultural way of war that can be seen as anti-urban. And I think that there's something specifically anti-urban about the Russian way of war. And I want to be quite clear about what I mean by a way of war here. I don't mean something that's explicitly coded into doctrine. I think it emerges because of a complicated variety of patterns. And here I mean investment, so the type of weapons that a particular military both develops and deploys, procurement, so the again, the kind of type of equipment that's purchased and brought to the battlefield, training, what that equipment is actually kind of meant to be used for, understanding of the enemy. And by understanding of the enemy, I mean the way in which a particular military, the kind of culture that pertains to imagining who the enemy is and how to hurt them and so on, right? And I think that in this sense, there's a kind of culture that emerges, which is more than just written doctrine. It's more like a kind of strategic, tactical kind of culture, which leads to particular patterns. And I think that my sense is that from Kabul through Grozny now to Ukraine, there's a pattern, particularly in Russian warfighting, which I think is specifically anti-urban. And it's different from the anti-urbanism, say, of North American warfighting, which I think has a kind of anti-urban element, particularly if you saw in kind of Iraq, for example. But it's very different. And whereas the sort of North American tends to focus on treating the urban as a kind of complex terrain in which kind of forces have specialized kind of roles and so on and so forth. The kind of anti-urban warfare we're talking about here is effectively massive destruction of civilian objects using multiple launch rocket systems, air and artillery strikes, and so on. And I think that one of the things that I want to look at here is the way in which this is about a kind of simplification or a perceived kind of reduction of the urban environment, the reduction of its complexity, a kind of disassembling of the urban environment, a deliberate disassembling. And I think that's what makes the anti-urbanism of sort of Russian warfare through kind of Kabul, Grozny to Ukraine different to, for example, North American, sort of US kind of campaigns, for example, in places like Sadr City in Iraq, whereas it wasn't so much about kind of rubblizing the city to kind of disassemble it. It was about trying to work with the complexity of the terrain. And I think also that there's a kind of communicative, punitive intent. I think Konstantin talked about this a bit, that it's not just about creating a kind of flat terrain that's easier to operate in. It's about punishing and communicating to the enemy a particular kind of message. And so I'll come to that in a minute. But what I wanted to kind of give the impression, or I would at least want to start it with, is this kind of long entanglement between the city and war. And actually our perception that there's hesitation or indeed proscription of the urban environment, I think, is a very recent perception. And that actually there are lots of kind of anti-urban ways of war which pervade war fighting, such as Russian war fighting. And I think we should see those as kind of, there are different, and it's not one single anti-urban way of war, but there are different anti-urban ways of war. For example, if we went back to strategic bombing of Europe, for example, I think we'd see slightly different kind of tactics and strategies and cultures in that kind of way of war. I also want to kind of say something about the sort of ethics or politics of this kind of comment. I think I was once on Twitter talking about a kind of way of war, and I was accused of sort of reducing the sort of legal culpability. I don't think that recognizing this kind of thing means that, you know, those responsible, Russian armed forces, for example, aren't engaged in criminal activity, or indeed in and indeed shouldn't be held accountable for it. What I think is important is to notice that there are cultures and strategies that emerge within particular configurations of forces that do particular things to the city. And so simply writing it off as barbarism, and I think this point has been made well before as well, is not going to be enough to think about what the anti-urban component of this warfare achieves. And obviously that's quite important, because when we get to thinking about how we can protect and defend and reconstruct the city, understanding what's lost is, I think, a first step there. So in terms of kind of anti-urban violence, I want to kind of go back to some of the points about, I think that were mentioned in earlier talks in this series, about the communicative, or as I want to call it, following Max Bergholz, the kind of the generative nature of violence. I don't mean that to kind of valorize violence as a particularly kind of positive force. What I want to think about it is that violence isn't mindless. It's not simply kind of there to just sort of knock down the buildings in some kind of mass act of vandalism, but it seeks to have a kind of productive outcome. And again, not in the kind of normative sense of a positive outcome, but it seeks to produce something. So, for example, in the work that I wrote on the violence in Bosnia, I think that violence against the urban environment was productive of one of two things, or two interlinked things. It was productive of homogenization of cities and places. It was also productive of a denial of historical memory, and particularly a memory of kind of heterogeneity and plurality. And so I think one of the things we want to ask here is precisely what is being generated in this violence. And again, I think I agree very much here that there are two kinds of strategies. On the one hand, there's a kind of communicative strategy that this kind of violence communicates the vulnerability of the city, and in making the city vulnerable, can disassemble what it is to be a city, and therefore begin to kind of, if you like, kind of dissolve urban centers and urban ways of life. And we could maybe talk about kind of what that means and how one rebuilds those urban centers later. But I think also increasingly, as I watch it, I think something punitive as well, that it's designed to punish a particular way of life that appears particularly resilient and particularly opposed to those forces that are targeting cities. So I think that there are going to be kind of two kind of things. Well, one sort of overarching thing I want to. These two things, I think there's kind of one overarching kind of sense that I want to kind of think about the anti-urban nature of this violence. And that's really in this kind of idea about sort of disassembly, disconnection, unworking cities. And I think that different military strategies do this for different reasons. I think ethnic nationalism in Bosnia is potentially different to Russian aggression in Ukraine, and indeed Allied strategic kind of bombing of Europe, for example, in World War II. But I think that they might seek the sort of disassembly or dissolution or disconnection of cities for different reasons, or for different kind of communicative, punitive purposes. What they seek to be punishing or what they seek to be communicating might be different, but nonetheless, the basic dynamic is one of disconnection, disassembling the city. Here I think a lot actually of a recent comment that Judith Butler made about vulnerability. For those of you familiar with Judith Butler, of course, a kind of very sort of central part of her thinking about sort of what it is to be human is about the sort of already vulnerable, already kind of embedded into social relations, the nature of kind of life being already embedded into social relations. And Butler kind of describes this as a sort of existential vulnerability, if you like. And more recently, she's talked about the way in which this should extend to thinking about infrastructures, because it's not just that we're in relationships with other people, we're in relationships with the things that give us the kind of conditions for a livable life, I think, as she calls it, and that therefore our lives are intensely vulnerable. And this kind of violence communicates and preys upon that kind of vulnerability and the ability to sort of disassemble what it is to have a livable urban existence. So there are two patterns, I think, of that kind of disassembly or that kind of dissolving, disconnection of livable life. The first that I've written about in the past is Urbicide. And I think one of the important things to point out here is the deliberateness of both of these patterns of violence. I often, when I'm talking about this, I try and steer clear of intent, because I'm always slightly worried about the sort of psychological kind of component of intent and the speculation that's sometimes required to think about the intent of particular actors. But nonetheless, we can know that in this kind of violence, the destruction, widespread destruction of the urban fabric is deliberate. These weren't accidental strikes. This wasn't accidental kind of, sort of shells or missiles going astray. This was deliberate destruction and targeting of the urban environment. And I think the important thing here, when I am writing about Urbicide, is to think about it as the deliberate destruction of essentially mundane and everyday architecture, car parks, shops. As somebody once put it to me, all of the sort of ugly buildings that would never get onto kind of cultural protection registers and things like that. So beyond the sort of symbolic buildings, to think about the everyday architecture that's supportive of a livable everyday life in the city, so that it's possible for us to kind of think about the protection of symbolic buildings, religious buildings, for example, monuments, and so on and so forth. But we tend to kind of forget the massive destruction, deliberate targeting of more mundane and everyday architecture. The argument that I've put forward before is that this is a kind of, it's both, it's destroying the kind of the conditions for urban life here considered as kind of dense and plural, a space of kind of interaction and encounter that all of these kinds of everyday buildings make possible. And I think for all of us, the kind of sense that a city is a place of diversity, I think, is important. And I think actually one of the things to kind of think about here, and often when I talk about Urbicide, somebody will say, but look at city X, it is very ethnically homogenous or something like that. And I think one of the, or look at space Y, the conditions for entry are tightly controlled, for example. So for example, if you go to London, there are lots of kind of quasi-public spaces that are actually private spaces where the conditions for entry are governed quite tightly, and what you can do and not do in that space is governed quite tightly. And it appears there that diversity is being reduced. And I think my answer always to this is that actually, whenever we find spaces that are less diverse or less plural, there's always some kind of regime of control in place, or there has been in the past. There's either been some destructive episode that has sought to reduce that kind of diversity, plurality, or there is some kind of regulation ongoing. And that kind of is necessary because the public spaces of the city are spaces where it is possible for there to be encounters with diverse others. And that's been something recognized in urban theory since back in the early 20th century, when people like Lewis Worth were writing about what the modern city comprised. And they obviously thought that, increasing density increases encounters and therefore plurality, senses of diversity, and so on. So that actually attacks on kind of everyday urban fabric are precisely attempts to disrupt, disassemble, disavow these kinds of spaces where these diverse encounters can take place. And I think there are lots of ways we can see this. I mean, in Bosnia, I think I was interested in the way in which there was ethnic nationalist contention over who would own places, who would own and control spaces, how they would naturalize ideas of sort of the single ethnic nationalist spaces and so on. But we could also think about the diverse city as a kind of representative symbol of otherness and the resilience of diversity, and that aggressors can target precisely that kind of resilient sense that there are others that do not conform to their way of life, right? Or their way of thinking or being, or whatever you want to describe it. And that, it strikes me, might be a more kind of a way of thinking about kind of Russian anti-urban warfare, for example. So the second pattern of destruction I wanted to look at is the destruction of urban infrastructure. And one of the things that's really interesting here, I think, is that infrastructure is often regarded as the sort of boring, banal, and invisible elements of the city. And it can be sometimes difficult to bring those things out. And one of the things that, I mean, was kind of pointed to so dramatically yesterday, for example, is how these systems are only boring and banal and invisible until they are deliberately targeted. And at the point where they become deliberately targeted, their kind of centrality to the city is really highlighted. Infrastructure has been called the connective tissue that knits peoples, places, social institutions, and the natural environment into coherent relationships, the structural underpinnings of the public realm. And actually, the more I thought about Urbicide and I thought about kind of buildings, constructing spaces that were in principle open to plurality, diversity, multiplicity, however you want to describe it. I also came to think about the way in which those public spaces are also knitted together into a city as a whole, right? And there it seems to me that infrastructure is really important, so that you have kind of two sort of dynamics at work. On the one hand, you have the creation of spaces, and that's what Urbicide targets. On the other hand, you have the kind of linking together of all of these spaces and all of the kind of lives that are lived in and through these spaces. And that's the role that infrastructure plays, and the destruction of infrastructure kind of targets that. And I think we should think about infrastructure broadly here. I mean, I think power and water are the most important, but waste disposal, data flows, transport, and so on. And lots of these things are just kind of regarded as technical problems, and actually they come a long time after kind of discussions about how to save monuments and so on. People we're still regarding kind of things like data and electricity and water as kind of technical problems, right? And so one of the questions here is about how to kind of highlight the importance and centrality of infrastructure in urban life, and not see it just as a kind of technical background phenomenon. And I think, again, it's sometimes, if we think about the kind of the deliberateness of Urbicide, about the sort of widespread patterns of destruction and targeting of everyday architecture, it's important to point out again that infrastructure targeting is deliberate. So in the current, in yesterday's strikes in Ukraine, for example, speculation that there are civilian engineers advising Russian targeting in terms of kind of where and how to disrupt the electricity grid as much as they can. And indeed, I don't think that that's particularly conspiratorial thinking, given that a huge amount has been invested by militaries in working out how to target infrastructures, and so that these are not accidental kind of outages. They're not sort of just the consequence of massive bombardment, but they're deliberate and specifically targeted. So, for example, you have the actual development of kind of and deployment of weapons deliberately designed to cripple bits of infrastructure. This on the screen at the moment is the so-called blackout bomb, which the US did use in Belgrade. And I think the point to make here is that there is that this is not, it's not a simple kind of barbaric force multiplication, we'll target the water and that'll have an effect on morale, but there's a deliberate attempt to kind of disassemble what it is to have a kind of livable urban life. Of course, as everybody knows, the main problems with a lot of thinking about kind of infrastructure destruction is that it's often seen as something that's kind of an engineering problem, but that is not bloodless. I think one of the things to point out here is that, and I'll come to this in a minute in my kind of closing comments, is that actually what might be called the reverberating effects of infrastructure destruction are anything but bloodless, whether that's as Svitlana was saying, kind of a rise in traffic accidents because of the lights are out, or whether it's the fact that refrigeration fails, or whether it's the fact that hospitals can't keep running their kind of life support infrastructure and so on and so forth. It's anything but bloodless, but often the relationship between the lights being on and the consequence of the lights being off is a more kind of there's a discontinuity between these two things, and seeing those things as connected, I think, is really important, and seeing the connection between these two things as also a disassembling of what makes the livable city livable, what makes the urban environment livable. So what can we do about anti-urban warfare? I want to just say kind of two things in this regard, and then hopefully Maria will have more to say about kind of reconstruction and so on. I mean, I think that, there are good reasons for thinking that the city should be protected. It's primarily a civilian space. The physical fabric of the city, the urban fabric of the city, is necessary for a distinctive type of civilian life, urban life. And actually, it's interesting, as we see certain things recognized, for example, ecocide, the widespread destruction of the environment, it's interesting to think about how it would be possible to protect in a sort of similar way urban life. But I think actually one of the sort of most successful or interesting ways to kind of to contest anti-urban warfare at present is by showing that anti-urban warfare actually actually contravenes international humanitarian law. It breaks the law of proportionality. It doesn't satisfy the condition of distinction. So, for example, multiple launch rocket systems are neither proportional nor can they distinguish between civilians and combatants. Why is this important? Well, because I think earlier in my kind of writing on Urbicide, I was very kind of keen that there should be sort of some new type of crime, that we should, have kind of activism towards protecting the urban environment against crimes against urbanity. I'm still quite keen on that kind of project, but I think that there have been interesting projects more recently that have focused on the way in which anti-urban warfare can already be contested through international humanitarian law. So, for example, the political declaration on strengthening protection of civilians from consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, that's been recently kind of signed, and there'll be a conference on it this week, actually, and which focuses on the way in which explosive weapons in urban areas have reverberating effects, for example, and these kind of reverberating effects, the way in which using explosive weapons in populated areas doesn't just kill more people, but it has longer term effects on, for example, the urban character of spaces or the infrastructures and the kind of life that those infrastructures support. And so actually, I think in terms of kind of protecting against anti-urban war, I increasingly think that, or anti-urban ways of war, I increasingly think that that kind of sort of strategy of trying to use international humanitarian law to kind of protect the urban fabric that's necessary for sort of livable life in the city is an important kind of avenue to pursue. And I will leave my comments there. I hope that's kind of reasonably brief, and I look forward to any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Perhaps Maria Rosaria could come up with her presentation, and then we can go to the questions. So I'm happy to introduce now Maria Rosaria Vitale, who's Associate Professor of Architecture Restoration at the University of Catania, at the Department of Civil Engineering and Architecture. And she's going to speak about the legacy of war, about preservation and the importance of reconstruction in European cities.
Okay, I will show you my screen. So, okay, thank you so much for your kind invitation. Can you see the presentation? I cannot hear. I don't know why, but I cannot. So, however, I don't know why.
Yeah, it's okay. We can see your presentation.
Okay. Thank you so much for your kind invitation and for the insight previous talks. I would like to focus on the legacy of war, and starting from a quotation from an article and a book by Stephen Gebel and Derek Keane, who in 2011 wrote that the metropolitan dimension of total war remains an underestimated theme of both urban and military history. The attention of historians of war has mainly focused on the military, social, and cultural history of war, while architects and urban planners showed generally greater interest in ideas, processes, and financial measures of rebuilding and replanning cities. Therefore, my presentation will pay specific attention to the inscription of war on cityscapes and to the radical changes the urban environment often underwent due to the destruction from the war, but also by the reconstruction and the recovery from the traumatic effects of the conflict. And this keeping in mind that reconstruction is always much more than mere rebuilding. Following Martin's analysis, I would like to reflect therefore on different patterns of reconstruction in European cities, mainly referred to post-World War II town planning. In an article of 1989, Jeffrey Diffendorf argued that one must not see the end of the war of 1945 as the starting point for reconstruction. On the contrary, reconstruction was normally based on earlier conception of ideal urban forms, shaped by pre-existing institutions and laws and guided by individuals with pre-war or wartime experience in reconstruction planning. And also the research brought up these lines of continuity between the post-World War I, World War II reconstruction and previous planning experiences. Also underline the fact that the rationale behind all these categories of reconstruction is the idea of building back better. Building back better is a principle. Here is the definition of the United Nations General assembly. And building back better is a principle that still shapes international policies for post-conflict recovery, not only in the physical range, but also in societal purposes, taking into consideration the community's needs. And this pattern of reconstruction and generally the legacy of war and of urban reconstruction have been surveyed from very different standpoints. Here you can see two conceptual frameworks which set out categories which focus on different but complementary aspects. In the first one, forms of reconstruction are mainly viewed in the light of the approaches adopted in the different settings, post-disaster settings. And in the second one, the ICOMOS document pays more attention, greater attention to the physical reconstruction of cultural properties in this case, but we can also consider urban environment, reclaiming the point of view of architecture with obviously a final mention to the intangible heritage of knowledge and practice and beliefs that may support the capacity of communities in post-conflict recovery. Therefore, I will present some example of post-conflict reconstruction ranging from radical redesign to identical, so-called identical reconstruction, keeping in mind that such categories are not mutually exclusive and they can mix. Moreover, as in many contemporary armed conflicts, the fighting is often intermittent. It is important to highlight that the term post-conflict does not indicate the official conclusion of a war, but it may refer to an extended pause in hostilities. And therefore, we can start from the category of first aid and early reconstruction, because one of the first questions that emerged from the previous meeting was, when should or could we start rebuilding? Is it possible to rebuild while the war is still going on? In the picture, you see the city of Reims, whose mayor in 1915, while the city was still on the front line, said, at the first retreat of the enemy, the work of reconstruction must begin without any delay. After the evacuation of the last inhabitants in 1917, the city actually suffered the worst damage, thus proving that the presence of population represented the most effective way to protect the city and the built environment. So early reconstruction is not a post-war matter. And first aid and repair are a form of resilience, a form of resistance to the violence against the built heritage. Obviously, if you look at the technical aspects of rebuilding, we can realize that stabilizing and securing impacted buildings or structures has an important value in limiting damage, preventing collapse, and taking under control general deterioration, but repairing buildings and infrastructure and re-establishing essential services is a fundamental way to support the rehabilitation of the affected communities and also to somehow prevent displacement. In a first stage paradigm, past experiences represent the main reference and the cultural background for present-day guidance on early responses in post-conflict settings. And experiences in Balkan War, for instance, revealed that one of the main shortcomings was the lack of coordination between different organizations, both international and local. And also another main shortcoming was the destruction of the social capital due to the displacement of people and refugees. So therefore, in a first stage paradigm, we can frame objectives related to the physical dimension of built heritage, but also challenges for early relief to be responsive to the local needs and enabling the self-sustainable indigenous capacity for long-term reconstruction. And moving on long-term reconstruction, we can start from the utopic, also radical redesign. In 1990, Daniel Lequedic, talking about the reconstruction of the city of Brest, said, Brest was destroyed twice in two different ways, by weapon and by a choice of overblending that led to the systematic leveling of its ruins, as well as its fortification, and to the creation of an artificial plateau, sometimes 30 meters above the original site. Brest is a destroyed city, but also a swallowed city. Examples like Brest, Le Havre, or Coventry may help us to understand the results of a state-led and also technocratic approach, which gave the urban planners the opportunity to apply the ideas of modern movement in the implementation of the radical redesign of cities destroyed by the war. And according to the French Ministry of Employment, urbanism was the city without slums, without courtyards, bacterial nests, without stinging alley, without stagnating streams. And therefore, wartime destruction was seen, as being wrote, as a blessing in disguise. Governmental institutions and municipalities were responsible, were in charge for removing rubble and demolishing damaged building, also permitting additional demolition, even to the point of making a tabula rasa, like in Le Havre or in Brest. And a mindset shaped on the top-down control of planning decision led to introduce some measures like land consolidations and expropriation, with or even without appropriate compensation to the owners. The city of Le Havre, designed by Perret, which is here shown, is now protected as an outstanding post-war example of urban planning and architecture. However, its value has been difficult to convey to the inhabitants who suffered the radical disconnection between the remembrance of the lost city and the vision of the new one. The reconstruction of Le Havre and mainly the following participated process of heritageization will display exhibits the importance of the involvement of citizens in the planning processes, and also the role of new narratives in promoting the reappropriation of reconstructed cities by the inhabitants. Having a look to the number of reconstruction plans implemented after the war, we can realize that the most widespread model has been not the radical redesign, but rather a more reasonable modernization. According to Peter Larkham, several factors, especially funding and land ownership, led to the retention of many parts of existing traditional streets and block patterns, thus limiting the radical nature of most plans. However, a comparison between the pre-war urban morphology clearly demonstrates that the planners desired to reconcile the retention of the traditional cityscape with the adaptation to new and more modern urban models. Apparently minor adjustments in the urban layout, which were aimed at widening and straightening the roads or increasing the heights of the buildings, resulted in a thorough reorganization of buildings and blocks. And wartime destruction provided also the opportunity to rationalize cadastral properties and to enlarge the dwellings. Generally, the lots were expropriated and then returned to the owners after rebuilding. And also urban plans allowed the displacement of some of the properties and the dwellings in the suburbs. How was it implemented? Which were the measures and the instrument for implementing such programs? Old and closed courtyard were generally replaced by new spaces connected to the streets, and they generally function as car parks in compliance with the increasing traffic needs and almost totally disregarding the traditional shared use for the small communities' daily life. It is worth noting that such an approach was applied also for the reconstruction of small rural towns through the normalization of plot sites and the definition of some reoccurring building features. A new cityscape was shaped, vaguely resembling to the old one, at the cost of radical changes in urban forms, but also in community ties. Partial redevelopment is what can be useful to grasp the trends in the Italian reconstruction. Generally in Italy, land ownership and financial constraint influenced the reconstruction far more than other European countries where state-led urban planning promoted the radical modernization of old historical cities. In Faenza, that you can see on the left, urban planner decided for the retention of traditional roads and block pattern in the slightly damaged district, while a more radical redesign was proposed for the area of Borgo d'Urbetco. Here, you can see it on the left, heavily affected during the bombing of the bridge. The terraced houses in Faenza were rebuilt on the same footprint, as reconstruction on the site was also justified by the possibility of reusing the foundation of the destroyed buildings. And generally, new houses are taller than the new ones, than the old ones. As you can see on the right in Florence, in the area near the bridges, which was heavily destroyed. The increase in the height and number of floors in derogation to existing rules reveals the compromise between different interests and the pressure coming from economic powers and the real estate market. This permission for increased heights was aimed at facilitating and also accelerating the reconstruction carried out mainly by construction companies which generally replaced more modest private owners. Actually, such a derogation was often presented as a way to cope with housing crisis, but it was driven by financial speculation without any connection to community needs. And this also led to an irreversible change in the social fabric of the central areas, now destined for offices and housing for wealthier and richer classes. The case, instead of the Rue Royale in Orléans, allow us to highlight the conflicts between the objectives of modernization and the preservation of monumental context. In pre-war picture, on the left, we can observe the transformation caused by commercial use of ground floors and the presence of shop windows, which overlap the 18th century arcade. During the year of the Vichy government, therefore when the war was still going on, after severe bombing, a dispute arose between those who supported identical reconstruction of the streets and those who preferred substantial redesign in order to meet new the needs of modern traffic. And a compromise was finally made, and the arcades were opened up such to create a covered gallery for pedestrians and reserving the entire street for vehicular traffic. Almost all the buildings, even those spared by the war and the bombing, have been rebuilt with a reinforced concrete structure, which is concealed by stone facade. Nowadays, Rue Royale is a space with a rarefied, almost metaphysic atmosphere, incapable of qualifying itself as a place for social aggregation and still struggling to integrate itself with the rest of the city. And finally, identical reconstruction. I put quotation marks because thinking about an identical reconstruction is quite impossible. Economos said that the word reconstruction within the heritage discourse often implies identical reconstruction. That is, the rebuilding to a state as near as possible to the original. This is rarely achieved in practice. And the relationship with the original craft people has been lost. The authenticity of the original materials and their historic value cannot be regained, and evidence is incomplete. If you look at this case, it's a well-known case of identical, so-called, so defined identical reconstruction is the city of Saint-Malo. Obviously, if you compare the plan before and after the war, we can realize that the blocks have been hollowed up, have been empty, and there is no, it doesn't differ from the example we previously examined. The architecture is, the cityscape has been shaped with a sort of atmosphere recalling the old one, but it is a new modernized city, what we can see nowadays. And another identical reconstruction, so-called identical reconstruction, is that of Warsaw city center, that, like Le Havre, has been listed as a UNESCO heritage site since 1980, and it is considered as an exceptional example of the comprehensive reconstruction of a city that had been deliberately and totally destroyed, which contributed to the verification of conservation doctrines and practices. The reconstruction of Warsaw was aimed at re-establishing a particular historical cityscape, eliminating the 19th century development. The plan for the historical center included the demolition of buildings that were considered not coherent with the nostalgic restoration of the city pasts, and was complemented by with the construction of new ones. However, the general approach was aimed at the improvement of living condition, adjusting heights and windows of the buildings according to aesthetic and functional requirements. And nowadays, the restitution to private owners of buildings that had been taken over by the city is troubling thousands of tenants, triggering new conflicts and questioning again the role of architecture in promoting justice, inclusion, and social tolerance. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for you both for your fascinating presentations, and then now we can get to our questions. Does anybody have questions?
I have a question for Martin.
Great, go ahead.
It is a question about priority in recovering from the destruction of infrastructure, mainly, because my question was, do you think there is a gender perspective in recovering, the priority for the recovery of infrastructure? Because I think that recovering from traumatic events generally has a gender perspective, which is very often disregarded. I mean, in a male vision, main infrastructure are to be rebuilt, to be recovered, could be main connection roads and so on. But in a women perception, probably, I don't know, schools and other kind of kindergarten, nursery schools probably may help to include women in the reconstruction process and help them to also to work without be forced to look after children or elderly people. So my question was about the gender perspective in recovering from conflict.
Do you want me to answer that now, or do you want to take some other questions?
I think you can answer this one, and then we'll proceed to other.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. And I think that's a really, really good question. And one of the things that the activism and the campaign, which is now translated into political declaration about explosive weapons in populated areas, one of the things that's interested me there is precisely when they talk about reverberating effects. So when they're talking about the kind of effects that become apparent over time of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, one of the things that I've found particularly interesting and persuasive there is precisely this kind of gendered dynamic, that actually the use of explosive weapons in populated areas tends to disproportionately impact women and children. And I guess what in other kind of contexts are sometimes called definitive civilians, right? Children, women, the old aged, right? But I mean, I think that's a kind of, there's a lot of contestation around that. But certainly one of the points here has been to try and demonstrate that that I've been persuaded by those NGOs who have been pushing for that, and the governments who've now signed up to the political declaration, is because it recognizes something that, early on when I was trying to talk about Urbicide, I wanted to kind of really get at, which was the sort of the deliberateness, so that we shouldn't see destruction as kind of collateral or some kind of essential savagery or something like that. But that we want to see there's a deliberate pattern of use that then has these reverberating effects. Now, I think on the question of priority, I find that very hard. I know in my own mind, I think, well, everything has a kind of, flat sort of hierarchy, because how can we prioritize many of these different things, right? And one of the things that comes straight into the debate is precisely, well, you've got to turn the power back on. That needs to be done straight away, because if you don't, X, Y, and Z happen, right? And I'm sympathetic to those arguments, but I also want to always be thinking about how the fact that, for example, return wasn't prioritized until a long time after Dayton in Bosnia, for example. It was built into Dayton, but it wasn't prioritized until many other things had got done. That meant that there wasn't a kind of contestation of some of the patterns of herbicidal violence in Bosnia until very, very late in the day, and when some people didn't even want to return anymore, right? And so I think this question of priority is really, really hard. I mean, I'm in agreement with you broadly, which is that one of the things I've always tried to argue for is it's important to pay attention to mundane architecture, to everyday architecture, so that actually, all of the lots of the kind of discussion gravitates towards symbolic gestures, but absolutely schools and so on are important, deserve to be prioritized, right? Schools, hospitals, and so on. And I think some of the discussion around reverberating effects really focuses minds on that, because it makes you think.
And perhaps I can come up with a question: who is to decide on the priority? Because in Ukraine, we do have, as you told, for instance, that it's buzzwords like participation, like the community, the members of the community has to be a part of this process of reconstruction. But how to do that, I don't think we do have tools or instruments or even proper legislation how to do that. And of course, the municipalities would come up with their ideas of the priority, and people stay, muted.
Yeah, I wonder, Maria, do you want to say something about that? I mean, I thought what was interesting in your talk was kind of precisely that kind of question, is in some of those historical examples, how did reconstruction authorities get appointed in the first place? And so maybe you want to say something about that. I don't know.
Yes, about priorities, you mean? Yeah. Well, generally, I think that World War II reconstruction has been implemented in a male perspective. Also, the way the ideas of modern monument were modern movement were applied testified that it has been totally disregarded, the way of living of previous communities. Therefore, there was a strong effort to modernize the general system, infrastructural system, such as connection roads, railroads, or industries, and also to improve the economic capacity of the countries. It was a top-down led reconstruction, and this is one of the main aspects. I think it could be we could pay. We must pay attention. That is the involvement of local communities in not only the planning decision, but also in scheduling priorities. And there is an interesting document of European, I don't remember well, but it is something like the Europe of regions, with a specific attention to the participation and the involvement of local and regional authorities in the planning processes and in the reconstruction and recovery. And also there is a document, a position paper of the UNESCO. It is called, which places culture as the core center of reconstruction strategies, with a twofold direction: people centered and place-based strategies, promoting different forms also of financial financial support, but also ways of collaborating, coming from foreign countries or institutional bodies, organization, and so on. For instance, in this document, focusing on the involvement of regional and local authorities, there is a very interesting proposal in improving city-to-city support. It is sort of twinning cities in supporting the reconstruction in Ukraine. Promoting not just the financial support, but also the knowledge exchange with shared initiatives to enabling local communities in making decisions, how can I say, deciding priorities. And this is the real challenge, because the Balkan Wars, I mean, I don't know very well the context of Balkan War, but one of, as I said, one of the main shortcomings has been the lack of coordination between local communities, international bodies, but also donors. The problem of donation is a crucial problem in post-war reconstruction. Coordinating action is of paramount importance in successing, I think. Therefore, the priority has to be very carefully adapted to local communities' needs.
Thank you. Thank you. Other questions?
I raised the hand. Okay. Thank you very much, first of all, for both fascinating presentation. And I have two questions to Martin. First one, does it make sense? What do you think about some kind of anti-urban violence typology along the line from simplicity to multiplicity? I mean, for example, two cases from nowadays, terroristic attack in Istanbul and Russian war in Ukraine, both at the same time. But and both we can see through the lens of pre-election terrorism, both as pre-presidential election in Turkey and Russia, but with different results. And therefore, we think about different approach, simple approach and multiple approach to reconstruct after terroristic attacked cities. In case of Istanbul, it was just explosion in the Taksim Square without essential results. Of course, it was killed people and semi-destroyed area, but just all. In case of Ukrainian city, we can see different kinds of violence, from rebelization to random terrifying bombing, to intentional infrastructure destruction, to targeting city diversity, to punitive urbicide, and so on, so on, so on. In this case, we can see Ukrainian city as a kind of laboratory to test different kinds of urbicide. And after that, in case of destruction, we can see about different approach or multiplicity of approach to reconstruct cities. What do you think? Does it make sense to think about such typology? And then the second question.
Yes, no, I think you're completely right. And I think you picked up on one of the things that or two of the things that I didn't have sort of time to discuss. But so I think you're completely right that we would want to look at the kind of actors that that are engaged. So I focused on sort of, what we would call sort of state militaries, but you're completely right. I mean, anti-urban violence is used by other kinds of actors, and so we'd want to pay attention to that. Also, by the way, thank you for kind of picking up on terror. I didn't really talk about terror, but I think when you're thinking about kind of communicative and punitive violence, terror is an important component, right? Of this kind of violence. So the communication of fear through the destruction of objects, the communication of vulnerability through the destruction of material objects, I think is an important component. And I think you're completely right. And I like the idea of a typology that recognizes multiplicity. I think one of the things that we always need to think about with urban violence, with anti-urban violence, is that there are different things going on at once, right? And so, for example, even in Urbicide, we have widespread deliberate destruction of the sort of mundane architecture of the city. We also have what would be more narrowly considered military targets being targeted, and that fits under the sort of the normal rubric of sort of military targeting, right? And I don't think we should pretend that that isn't happening. There are components of that. But there are also components of Urbicide coexisting. And I think you're completely right. Urbicide does more than one thing. I think you can probably think about a kind of generic sense of, for it to be anti-urban, it does the following. It disassembles a sense of interconnectedness, publicness, diversity, plurality, relatedness. But I think that but then the question about how it does that and why it does that, and actually I think it's not just how it does it, but it's why it does it. And I think one of the things I'm actually interested in, and I agree with your sense that Ukraine is a laboratory. I mean, I think every battlefield to a certain extent is a laboratory, and I think that this is best often pointed out by scholars of the Holocaust, actually, who talk about the sort of the way in which violence evolves over time through kind of through sort of experimentational patterns, right? But the question I keep coming back to with Ukraine is that I feel that there is some kind of it's not how it's being done, but it's what the effect is that interests me, because I feel that what we're seeing is the kind of culmination of a sort of historical trend that was often ignored. So Afghanistan is seen as kind of a long time ago. People forget about sort of Soviet destruction of Kabul, right? And then Chechnya is always seen as a kind of isolated example of savagery, but actually in February, it was all the same kind of weapons that had been deployed in Grozny being, coming back out into Ukraine. And so the question is sort of what's the effect of these multiple methods for sort of taking the city apart, and thinking about what the effect is in the Russian case. is different to what the effect is in, say, the US case in Iraq, for example, or the Bosnian Serbs in Sarajevo, or any of these. And but I think you're right. Then we can begin to build a typology that would be entirely acceptable. And just in terms of reconstruction, actually, just coming back to Svitlana's, I mean, look, I think that there's a problem around complexity. I'm not sure there are any simple kind of patterns for reconstruction. There will always be lots of things going on at once, and I think this kind of question of coordination then does become important. But also we forget that some of the complexity itself, kind of works against coordination. So, for example, and this might be different in the Ukrainian context, but in many cases, for example, the fact that infrastructure is privatized largely means that reconstruction of infrastructure is often outside of the scope of large-scale public works, for example, right? And so the model that we had after the Second World War, when infrastructure was often still a kind of public good, no longer applies, because infrastructure is a private good and will be fixed without reference to users and so on and so forth, right? So there's that kind of sense that there's always probably going to be some kind of coordination deficit, but I'm not sure whether rebuilding after a single act of terrorism, it's more time limited, but does that mean it's less complicated? I mean, I think about kind of rebuilding after the 2005 attacks in London. These were very complicated, that process of kind of reconstruction was still quite complicated, and manifested that sort of complexity of bringing private and public and users together in a way, and they didn't agree, and we got a result which is partly improvised, partly coordinated, right? So I know that doesn't answer your question, but that's what I think about it.
Yeah, thank you very much. I absolutely agree with you. And as a question, thank you very much for your emphasizing on generative side of anti-urban violence. And what do you think case of Borodyanka in Ukraine in line of this generative side, the generative force? What does that mean? I mean, Borodyanka in previous pre-war time, it was some kind of ordinary shrinking to some extent company town just outside of suburban belt of Kyiv. But after this terrifying bombing, random bombing of multi-store housing, it attracted Banksy. And Banksy how to say, visited some places, including Borodyanka, and left some murals or artworks. And after that, new flow of visitors. Now in Borodyanka, last weekend, I visited this area, different murals by Banksy, and it was very interesting to see so many new faces, new people. They can diverse this small city in terms of, for example, cafes. I saw a long line of visitors to cafes that was never previously seen in this small town. And is it a chance to change this much more less diverse city in pre-Urbicide time in comparison with nowadays? Is it really so-called generative force of Urbicide and from destruction to production or something kind of this?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really interesting question. Maybe Maria will have something to say about it as well. I mean, I'll say two things. So I think firstly, and I was actually very interested in the way that you phrased it when you kind of spoke a couple of seminars ago. I mean, I think the generative aspect is for me, there's a kind of fundamental kind of question about seeing violence. I don't want to see violence as rational, but at the same time, I don't want to just write it off as kind of barbarism, savagery, craziness, that kind of thing, because of course that means that it's essentially, you know, kind of random, and then there's nothing we can really say about the patterns or about the kind of the potential it has to kind of achieve certain things, right? And of course, what it achieves might not necessarily be the goals of the actors who initiate the violence. I suppose in the case that you're talking about, I think about kind of, there are, again, maybe this comes back to your typology, there are different things that are generated by violence. There's the sort of the short term, the sort of the disassembly of the city, the terror, right? And I think it's quite important. I mean, often when I talk about Urbicide, you know, somebody at some point says, yes, but what about the people? There are people dying, which of course is the case, and we can't not recognize that. You know, and when I, you know, so for example, this is kind of classically sort of the discussion that I had with Martin Shaw, for example, you know, sort of 10, 15 years ago about sort of which is more important, genocide or Urbicide. I don't think either are more important. They can happen together. And then the question is, well, people are being killed. This can have a kind of generative, insofar as what I mean by generative there, I mean it's communicative. It communicates, say, for example, terror, right? Or it takes apart the urban as a kind of site of resistance, right? You know, the idea that these are cities where people are different to, for example, you know, Russians, for example, and we're taking that kind of principle of difference apart. But then you're right, there are the long-term kind of questions. And there, I think, actually what's really interesting is precisely the kind of chance and contingency involved in the way that reconstruction proceeds, that actually, you know, despite all of our kind of research about destruction and reconstruction, and it comes back a bit to Svitlana's kind of point, right? That there isn't a kind of committee in waiting that immediately kind of gets set up and says, right, this is what we're going to do. That actually there's an element of contingency, so that nobody could have quite predicted that Banksy would come along and paint the murals, but it happened, and this will affect the way that reconstruction proceeds, and also will almost kind of reverse a kind of historical dynamic of decline and make this a kind of urban site. I don't want to say center, but site that doesn't just decline into nothing, but, you know, or decline into, you know, sort of a rural kind of, or sorry, peripheral, sorry, that's what I wanted, the word, you know, peripheral site, but will become something more. The only caveat I would add is, of course, that the one thing we haven't discussed throughout this series that's actually, I think, quite central to the experience of Urbicide, but also reconstruction, is war tourism. And I don't know what the view is around the murals. So we have a big Banksy exhibition in Manchester at the moment, and it's all a bit, it's framed as kind of political, but it's not. It's all about consumption. So it's really interesting, as in that you consuming the spectacle of activism. So it's very interesting, but I'm not sure. But this kind of notion of turning the destroyed city. I remember going to Sarajevo, and in what, 1996, and I remember actually a taxi driver being quite upset that I didn't want to go on a kind of tour of the worst kind of sites, you know, and so that kind of role that this sort of dark tourism, whatever you want to call it, plays, you could see what you're talking about there in that, and that might be something to think about. I'm sure that as time goes on, people are going to arrive and they're going to affect the reconstruction process, because they're going to make particular sites into particular kinds of symbolic kind of places. But I think maybe Maria has something to say as well.
And I think I'm sorry to interfere, but it could happen with Mariupol, for example. I'm thinking of Mariupol as a place of war tourism then.
Yes, the steelworks. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yes, there are many examples of war tourism in, for instance, in World War I, when this kind of attitude emerged. But yes, there was a very large phenomenon emerging after the World War I, and this kind of Bruns was one of the main cities who was at the center of attentions of war tourism. But what is quite interesting is that Michelin published also many guides for war tourism after World War I, and there was a huge interest in this kind of, not only by the relatives, but also it was a collective way of remembering the war. And what is interesting that in the occasion of the centenary of World War I, France completely decided to completely cancel, erase the traces of the fire occurred in the cathedral, which was one of the main episodes of war crimes or crimes against cultural properties. And I will use a term that I don't like, which is urban identity. I don't like so much identity. I prefer to talk about communities, because identities are always things to evolving, and we should use identities always in plural. So this identity of the city as a place of World War I memorialization has been almost refused. Nowadays, only just the museum outside the town recall these events, and the cathedral has been completely restored, and the statues and the stones has been replaced as to cancel any traces of war. So we can wonder, we can ask how long this kind of war tourism, this kind of interest will last, will be of interest, will be on. So I think probably it could be just a temporary interest. And that's why I think that the involvement of local communities is of paramount importance in deciding what the future of a city has to be. Because probably the continuing in conveying conflict remembrance is not often useful to enabling for reconciliation. There is, in the first talk, Francesco Mazzucchelli said that there was a part of oblivion in each way of remembering, and on the contrary, there is a part of memorization in each production of oblivion. What's the role of oblivion in reconnecting links, and in also in enhancing and in promoting the diversity which Martin was talking about? Probably there is a role also for the oblivion, also for the selection of what we have to remember. that's my opinion. In post-conflict, yes, there is an important aspect related to the remembrance, but also in the first part of my presentation that I cut off, there was the idea of ruins as counter monuments, because they convey a different way of remembering. The horizontality of the destruction is a way of a more intimate way of conveying memory instead of that of traditional memorials or monuments to the memory of war. And therefore, I don't know if this tourism of war, this dark tourism that is now really of great interest for people, would be an effective way to reconcile.
Yeah, you are definitely right in terms of temporarity of war tourism and more broader so-called dark tourism that are very popular in different places, and it will be just with temporary effect. But in case of Borodyanka, very interesting that now open discussion concerning what we should do with these murals by Banksy. One proposal to sell
decided
it, to see as an investment to city development. If we sell it, we will give money to not just reconstruct but develop city, and or just preserve these murals for future generation. And
not in the spot they are
way?
actually situated. They decided just to take it away to some place and to have it in some place, which is stupid, you know, because it's site-specific art, in fact. But anyway, but for example, Chernobyl zone, it became more and more popular recently, 30 years after the disaster, more than 30 years after the disaster. And I think it's more about marketing this thing. Also, so we will see what will happen with the Banksy murals. Yeah, I'm following the case about it.
In the area near Gostomel airport, it was some kind of feeling of the same as in Pripyat, as a ghost small town, small neighborhood without any people, with destroying the building, and in autumn time it was more dangerous, and it makes sense to think about different ways of should we reconstruct this neighborhood, or should we preserve as a memory Urbicide or other. It's really a complicated question how to deal with any case, any neighborhood, any area in our city. And of course, with true participation of community, not top-down decision, we will do such way or other way. It's very important now to preserve participating effect on development.
But generally, reconstruction reasons prevail. In the history, the preservation of ruins is quite, there are few examples. We have cases and examples of maintenance and preserved ruins, but examples of entire villages or neighborhoods are not so common. For instance, there are the twin towns of Belchite in Spain and Oradour in France. And but the approaches to the preservation of these ruins these towns in ruins has been really different, because Belchite, which is the symbol of a bitter civil war, has been, I'd seen, left as it was, while Oradour has been kept as it was. It's quite different, because nowadays Belchite is a town in rubble, is hard to walk through the village, through the town, because of the unsafety of buildings and roads. There is now an association, there are initiatives, there is a growing interest in preserving and restoring the site of Belchite, but it is still a place of competing memories. Oradour is a really different case. In that case, it was specifically established to keep the ruins, and therefore the site was listed as a monument. It has been a continuous and ongoing work of maintenance. But on the contrary, what we see in Oradour is a kind of artificialization of ruins. So there's no just one solution to the memorialization through the ruins, but generally reconstruction, the reasons to rebuild is the main way to cope with the post-conflict, with the trauma.
Yeah, you're right. I think, you know, the Hostomel perhaps will be rebuilt totally, because it's a small town near the city with an airport, which was first aimed and which was thought of becoming the third airport for Kiev. And perhaps in some places we will have these ruins like memorialized. We will see what happens.
Sometimes in other work I've used the sort of difference between sort of improvisation and orchestration, right? So that when we're talking about this kind of tension between what will happen essentially without necessarily coordination versus the attempts to try and coordinate, you can see that much more as a kind of orchestration, but it doesn't always translate into what happens on the ground. And I think actually one of the interesting things about the kind of discussion you're having is I'm also mindful that lots of the buildings that we're talking about in, say, Sarajevo or now in Kiev, lots of those buildings are unsafe and will have to come down. So actually there's no real option to preserve the ruins. And by unsafe, I mean, it's not just that they're structurally unsound, it's that leaving them there to decay would involve certain kinds of releases into the environment of materials that we don't want released into the environment, right? So that actually there's no option to preserve the ruins in that regard. And I guess that then we also get these kind of competing questions about privatization, private land ownership, private infrastructure concerns, and so on and so forth, which means that there's no sort of simple kind of model of sort of top down, bottom up. There'll be this kind of improvised kind of reconstruction that will include to certain degrees, right? It'll be inclusive to a certain degree, lesser and more depending on. But what I'm also mindful of here is that we also forget how, and I think, you know, you pointed this out, Konstantin. I mean, the idea of Urbicide arises first in the US to precisely talk about the kind of ongoing process of urban maintenance, right, and renewal. And we forget how much maintenance is involved. So we often talk about these kind of processes in very sort of binary terms. Something's destroyed and it just stays like that until it's rebuilt, and then it just stays like that. But actually there are all these kind of constant ongoing processes of maintenance, whether it's maintaining ruins, as Maria's just kind of pointed out, or whether it's the kind of renewal. And I think also there's this kind of unpalatable kind of aspect that sometimes infrastructure providers will see this as an opportunity rather than as a, that maintenance, for example, which can become difficult. I mean, imagine the situation in London, for example, when the Tube was out of access because of a terrorist strike. That's an opportunity for infrastructure providers to schedule maintenance that they wouldn't have been able to do otherwise, right? And so there are all these kind of competing concerns that lead to this much more sort of improvised renewal kind of process, I think. Yeah. So I sometimes see it more as a kind of question about sort of the tension between improvisation and orchestration rather than planning and participation,
Yeah, or we have some risk of non-military urbicide after military urbicide. Yeah, in terms of new construction with low quality, with new high-rise panel building houses, and it will be new urbicide. It's also our cities under such risks. And yeah, thank you very much for this discussion. Yeah, I am happy.
You're welcome. Maryana, shall you?
Yeah, does anyone have one more question, maybe? If not, I think we can finish now. And I also would like to thank you all for joining, for your very interesting presentations. And one more time, I would like to remind about the recordings that all the previous meetings are also saved on NAMU YouTube page. And I really think that during all these talks, we gather a lot of different thoughts, ideas, reflections, and even questions. And all this information, of course, could be very inspiring and give us even some tips for the processes of reconstruction of Ukrainian city. So once again, thank you all, and wish you calm night, calm week, and see you in the future event as well.
Thank you so much for participation and for lively discussion. Thank you.